My name is Charlie Smith, and I'm editor of Pancouver. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by new media artist Remy Siu. He's a composer based in Vancouver, which is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. In his biography, Remy states that his recent work has involved the construction of automated and variable performance apparatuses. They employ light, sound, software, and the body. Remy is the co-artistic director of Hong Kong Exile. He's the founder of the independent video game studio Sunset Visitor. He's collaborated with many other artists and organizations, including Vicky Chow and Theater Replacement, among others. Thanks for joining me today, Remy.
Thanks for having me.
Um, I'd like to start with Hong Kong Exile Arts Association, which is a company comprised of yourself, Milton Lim, Natalie Tinian Gan. What would you like our readers to know about Hong Kong Exile?
Yeah, Hong Kong Exile is interdisciplinary arts company made up of, as you said, the three of us, and we all kind of have different um, artistic backgrounds. You know, myself is in music composition and new media, and Natalie has a background in choreography, dance, and poetry. And Milton has a background in experimental theater, and I also know he does like new media as well now. Um, we, I think, really focus on telling Asian diasporic stories, specifically around Hong Kong diaspora. But very specifically, I would say we are interested in devised experimental performance, and often using kinds of digital technologies and hardware to augment that performance in a lot of ways. And so I would say one of the leading things that we always do is try and subtract from our own artistic disciplines to try and find ways that we can collaborate and fit together, as opposed to say an additive process where we're just trying to like stack our disciplines on top of each other, that each discipline has to, to a certain extent sacrifice something so that it can more readily coexist with another discipline, say in that project. So something that, I always stress with Hong Kong Exile and also in our other works is that we want, diversity of content, but we also do want diversity and challenge of form as well.
Well, it sounds like you need to have generous collaborators
Yeah,
when you're using
yes.
that model.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it was, I would say that it was a little bit more difficult when we started. But that was just something that we learned over time is that unless we were willing to adjust our priorities as artists, depending on each project, then um, we found that the work would be less interesting. I don't know. That it was just more that once we started making those kind of sacrifices, so to speak, is when we really started to open up new
And,
space
and
that we could explore.
and what are you hoping to convey through Hong Kong Exile? Because artists are often driven
Hmm.
to convey something, and I'm wondering what your mission is.
I do think it's different with every project. But I think, yeah, like as I said earlier, the biggest thing for us to convey is that we wanted to um, be able to speak about these kind of diasporic narratives um, i- in no way in any traditional sense,
Mm.
and that we wanted to continue to still um, challenge form or grapple with form, grapple with um, different kind of challenges in any specific um, kind of discipline and really attack that head on. And that's a pretty dry answer to
Maybe you could
because
provide an example, and
uh,
then that would bring it to life.
yeah, I mean, I think for example, let's say in the dance work room 2048, we use a lot of we use only kind of digital projection lighting, and that allows us to, do many things. One of them is to make cuts and changes very quickly and change scenography very quickly, like at a at a press of a button. And that kind of introduced a kind of cutting technique onto stage, that was a little bit more difficult to achieve, say with analog lights. Say for example, like analog lights they do have a curve. So like when you turn off an analog light, it does kind of take some time for the brightness to dissipate. Whereas with digital light, it's almost instant, if not instant. And so, this kind of created an ability to cut on stage. And so you see in that work, a lot of cutting between scenes, trying to experiment with how can we um, slice the space, so to speak, and be able to cut back and forth between it, almost like film, but on stage, and in a space. And so that's one example of like, hey, like that's a kind of um, organizing principle, that we can kind of gather around in that piece and really experiment with, while also kind of exploring stories, and specifically diasporic stories of the people on stage. And I would say that kind of for us, it's always been really that we wanted to pair these things with experimental techniques where we get to be playful and discover new things, because we do think that being a member of diaspora is a general sense, an affect of listlessness and searching and looking. And so if we didn't do that in the form, and if we didn't do that in the art, um, there would be an essential affect or missing piece of it, right? Like we didn't want to just convey that in the content itself. We wanted the form to speak that or resonate that.
And how does that manifest in the music that you're creating?
Well, I would say again, it's very different in different projects, right?
Yeah.
Like say in that dance work where music was, say, less of the general exact moment to moment music composition was less of a priority. Again, that was, say, something where I had to be like, okay, I think um, if I through composed this, there would be something not right about the work. So in that particular performance, I used a lot of samples, um, and to a certain extent was quote unquote DJing those samples on stage, and mixing them and live remixing them, um, to kind of provide an affect that we were looking for. And so that maybe that's a great example of me being like, okay, like, obviously I have my own music composition practice, but I'm not going to through compose and notate, or like, you know, make the music here, because I think if I did that, it would bring a kind of intention, an extra level of intention and in a vector that I think did not fit
Yeah,
in that
too
piece.
prescriptive. Yeah.
Too prescriptive, yeah. Or like, there's an intention when I'm through composing, I'm like very, you have intention with everything you do. And so I needed to remove a layer of my own intention in that regard to
It's
make the work.
fascinating.
So,
Um, Now with Sunset Visitor,
mm.
you founded that in 2021 as an independent video game studio. What were your objectives when you set out to do this?
I think, I mean, Sunset Visitor was founded in the middle of the pandemic, or not even the middle. I guess it was like at the beginning now. And this was something where you would look at 2019 or early 2020, Hong Kong Exile, myself, um, and others and our peers, like we largely um, made a living kind of making projects and then touring those projects. And of course, in the performing arts, we needed to be present to do that. And then the pandemic obviously affected that. Um, and so in around March 2020, I was kind of sitting around thinking like, oh my God, I don't know when we're going to be able to do performance again.
You
And
need
all
a
the
new career.
Yeah, yeah, like all the performance infrastructures that have been damaged. And in my experience, I know those things are going to take a long time to recover because they're so painstaking to set up in the first place. It's always a case of easy to tear down, hard to set up. Um, and so I was thinking like, well, how am I going to practice? How am I going to do things? And I like making things. Like I do like making things. And if I can't make things, it makes me sad. And so um, that was kind of the impetus. Like I'd always wanted to make video games, and looking into some of the work that I was already doing on stage, where I was employing real-time algorithmic systems on stage in a kind of like game-like way. It made sense for me to start to think that like if I was ever going to do a proper video game, say, this seems like the time to do it. And so that kind of was the start of a very long, like 3, 4 year process for me of releasing our first game, which is out now. It's called 1000 Times Resist. It's on Steam and Nintendo Switch.
Did
And
it
our
feel?
goal, pardon?
Sorry, you said it's on. I should let you repeat the network, the
Oh yeah,
distribution
it's
networks is
it's
on.
on
I'm sorry,
Steam
I
and
interrupted you. The
yeah, no
most
worries.
important part
It's on
of the interview.
it's on Steam and Nintendo Switch
Okay.
currently, and or PC and Nintendo Switch. It's on other PC stores, but very likely listeners will probably be getting it on Steam. Um, but like, the goal of the company was that we would take our performing arts practices, um, and apply that into kind of interactive digital media spaces. And we kind of saw it, or at least I saw it as an extension of our current practices and our current interests. And I think if anybody who has watched any Hong Kong Exile work or any of my own work, um, and went to play this game, they would be like, "Oh yeah, this is kind of very recognizable." So yeah, that was our that was at least my primary desire, was to start a game studio kind of around the practices that we would bring from our experimental performing arts.
And how did you feel when your debut video game, it was nominated for all these awards? And I'm
Uh,
just wondering what went through your mind when that happened.
I relief. I don't know because it's one of those things where you bet the farm on something, and it's and also took a you know relatively large chunk of my life to make. And I mean, long story short, it does feel reassuring, I think. But I think I'm most proud of the fact that you know as I said, the goal of the company was to bring experimental performing arts in a very local version of it, right? Like I would say a very local Vancouver version of it. um you know Vancouver between 2010 and 2020, and maybe even before that, I'm very biased in the fact that I was only around that period of time. I'm like even going back to the perhaps the decade before, with the founding of Theater Replacement, Theater Conspiracy, Push Festival, um, the effect that someone like Norman Armour had on the local scene, when it came to performing arts, like all of that kind of charted a very specific lineage in the performing arts in Vancouver that deeply influenced me and my collaborators and my generation. Um, and so, like it's sad to look back in retrospect that to a certain extent, we were on the tail end of that before, a large event changed many things. But in spirit, we were really taking that very local version of experimental performing arts, kind of built over many decades here in Vancouver, with very specific expressions and practices and processes, and taking it into video games. And because video games is a much larger kind of global platform, um, to transmit that out, and to have people respond well to it is one of those things that I'm really happy about, because it's like I mean, because throughout the production of the game, there's many times where I would, you know, go into a corner and say like, "Oh, does anybody care? Does did we have anything locally here that was of any significance?" And like my instinct was that yes, there's a local Vancouver experimental performing arts expression that I care about and I think is valuable and interesting. And to have kind of the gaming world and also fans kind of react to it in a way that is as positive as has been is um, very nice. I would say it's
It's
very
kind of sad
interesting.
that
Yeah.
Norman isn't alive here to hear you speaking, because to
Well,
think that this vision that he had, which has affected so many people's
yeah.
lives, is actually almost being exported through video
Yeah,
games.
I would say this. I would say that this, yeah, it's a vision that he had that we are exporting, and I'm happy that people are happy to receive it. Um, I did tell Norman before he passed. Norman actually has a role in the game, I believe it's his last role.
Oh,
And
interesting.
we
Yeah.
went to his home to record him, actually not too many weeks before he had passed. And he gave a really amazing performance. Um, and
Incredible.
so he's in the game. So he's there with the message being sent out. So
And
yeah.
and aside from Norman, who are some of the other people who've influenced you on this creative journey that you're on, Remy?
Well, I think so many people locally, I think it's like well, theater replacement for sure, like Maiko and Jamie, um Stephen Hill, you know, who I studied under at SFU, um was a huge influence as well. Um that you know, Stephen was my first introduction to device performance, and I think a lot of interestingly, I think a lot of the things about what the fans and critics say about the game, or what they like about it is are many of the feelings that I had when I first experienced device theater, a work of device theater locally produced, like a Leaky Heaven work or a theater replacement work, um, which kind of was why we were interested in doing a device process beyond the fact that is what we were taught. Um, and of course, you know, on the music side, you know, all my teachers like Barry and Barry Trax, Rodney Sharman, David McIntyre, Owen Underhill, Janet Danielson. Yeah, so like I don't know.
There's
I mean, this
lots
is
of
maybe
different.
my music background where it's like, you know, we definitely understand as composers that we are of a lineage of some kind. Um,
And are you working on a second video game now? Or
uh,
many video
yeah,
games?
well, we are continuing making video games, and so we're working on very early research on a couple of different things that we might be doing.
And will there be a Vancouver connection to this one as well, or is it too early to say?
Oh, at least one of them has a pretty strong Vancouver collection. Sorry, connection.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we're going to continue to have. Like I do really believe in the locality of it. Like even though we're exporting to like a much larger kind of global platform, something like Steam or the Switch store or whatever. Um, like even with this game, you know, all of the performers in it, all the voice actors are local, like Norman being one of them, and many of our mentors are voice actors in this game, like Maiko and Jamie. Um, but many of the uh, voice actors are local um, Asian Canadian performers, and so I do think that that's something that we'd like to continue to do and focus on, where it's like, hey, you know, we have a lot of really amazing Asian Canadian talent here in Vancouver, but for various reasons, um, you know, they don't get to maybe show off every side of their talent that they get to. And so, you know, one of the other things I'm very happy about with the game that we just released is providing, I think at least, really kind of meaty and sophisticated roles to these performers. And really, they would keep surprising us all the time in the recording booth with how much depth and talent they would bring to it when given the opportunity. And so, like, that's something that, and I think this is also this is the wild thing that fans and critics abroad have noticed is that the voiceover performances that they're citing as pretty exceptional, and like I
So
have very
what
little.
got you the awards for the performance
Yeah,
in
yeah, and
part?
so
Yeah.
like and so I think that's uh again another thing where it's like so much of it is that like we are trapped locally here in Vancouver for various reasons, largely maybe out of distribution, but you know, if any like if one of the gambles with the game that we just made was like, hey, I really believe in this local processes and talent and et cetera, um, and have that to be proved out that is like true that some of this stuff does matter to other people. I think that's something that just gives us more motivation to kind of continue that.
Well, that's wonderful. And as an artist of Asian ancestry, how does this inform your work? Do you think
I,
about that?
oh yeah, I mean, if obviously Hong Kong Exile, the name of the company, and then um, it's a huge part of 1000 Times Resist. It's very much a game made for Asian diaspora, and then of course even more specifically um, Hong Kong immigrants. And if we back up one more scale, just in immigrants in general, the experience of immigration, the experience of migration, the experience of being an other, um, all of that is hugely, I think, um, embedded in all the work that we do, specifically the game. I think in general, kind of the experience of being diaspora hugely informs just the general sense of my 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 flippantness towards any kind of tradition. It does, that plus the fact that I went to experimental art school, like, it really kind of puts me in a place where I'm like, I don't really care how things used to be done, or I have very little reverence for how things used to be done, especially if there's no reason to do it like that anymore. So if there's anything that can be like leveled against me is that my lack of patience for for that kind of thing is like, pretty low.
You're
Um,
happy overturning conventions if it makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
if it makes sense. So that I think that is definitely something that informs me in that way, and specifically just like lived experience of like um, this is something we cover in the game a lot. Like, why are you nostalgic for a home that you've never experienced? Why are you attached to things that um, you know, could be said is not yours. Um, all of this kind of tension in being a member of the diaspora, and maybe not even of Asian descent, like of any
Yeah. But I
diaspora
also wonder,
community.
I mean, like when you walk around Vancouver,
Mm,
we're on the Pacific. We
hmm.
have, century and a half more if you go back to
Yeah.
Mears
Yes.
Island of Asian presence in this
Yeah.
part of the world. And even the Filipinos came to North America
Yeah.
before the Mayflower.
Yeah.
Um, and yet it's not really reflected in our media, in our popular culture, to the degree that you see on the streets. And
Yeah.
and and I'm wondering that almost disconnect whether you've observed this and
Oh yeah.
if you think about it and what you'd like our readers to know.
I think about it a lot. And you see this in games too, and that was one of the other impetuses of making the game. It's like, there's very few games that get to talk about Asian diaspora, um, you know, or being diaspora being a immigrant or being diaspora in the diaspora community, I should say. Um, it's not an accident that many of the more recent games that talk about this, including our own, are Canadian. There's a game called Venba, and it's made in Toronto. It's about um, being a immigrant in the 80s, and kind of cooking culture and kind of how that slips away and how that comes back in cycles. Um, I guess the only thing I can say that, and I can be scathing because I'm not in that industry, is that I do think that Canadian broadcasters, I think there's a situation where the infrastructures are set up where there's many layers in which um, creators of, BIPOC creators have to try and get something made through the Canadian broadcasting system. And of course, like people can say like, why don't they go to YouTube? Why don't they go to, and they do, but I would say that like any kind of funding, larger amounts of funding that you can get to create something is locked up um, with very specific requirements where you need to have a partner with a broadcaster in Canada. And, navigating that minefield or that maze was something that I was completely uninterested in. This is why I went to go make video games, right? Like, relatively
Yeah, you
making,
can bypass it.
yeah,
And
you just bypass it completely. And so, um, yeah, like I do think about that a lot, and I don't know why. Well, I do know why. I don't know why it hasn't changed, or like
Yeah.
why those things continue to
Well, it's one
be
of
a
the
part of
reasons
it.
we created Vancouver, because it's like, vast swaths of the population are being invisibilized,
Yes, yeah,
and that needs to change. Now,
yeah.
with I'd also like to raise the word Chinese, because
Mm,
it's a broad term, and it could be a language, it can be an ethnicity, it can be a nationality,
hmm
it can be a race,
hmm
if you buy into the construct of race. Um, but there's also a distinct Hong Kong identity, and I'm wondering what goes through your mind when you hear the word Chinese.
Obviously that word can be uh is complicated, especially for people who have a background in Hong Kong or in Taiwan, and in other places. Um,
Now I guess Xinjiang too. It's
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah. So,
Tibet. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, of course, like it is very complicated, and I think beyond having complicated, beyond saying that it's complicated, that I just think of so many different things when it's brought up. Um, and you know, honestly, I don't even know how to answer
It's
that
too big
question.
of a
It's
question.
too big
Yeah.
of a question.
Well,
Um,
you've also got the issue of xenophobia here in North America and
yes, yes,
xenofascism in
yes,
China. So,
yeah,
but
yeah,
and then how those two interact.
yes, yes.
But the other thing I'm also wondering if there are any stereotypes, about this
Mm.
word that you'd like to address.
Oh, there's so many. I mean, I think, one of the, there's a work I made called Foxconn Frequency, and one of the earliest thoughts about making that work is that there's just a general, in the music world, there was some general stereotype that players, specifically maybe Chinese players, musicians, I should say, were unfeeling in their performance. And there's many cultural uh, kind of like geopolitical and like economic reasons for that. Um, why that may be uh, true sometimes. And with the work with some of that Foxconn frequency, we really wanted, or at least I really wanted to create a kind of system or apparatus that both kind of confronted the the types of pressures that these musicians may face, but also conversely make a space for them to fail openly in public, um, to kind of allow that humanity to just um, how one deals with failure or confronts it, or how a musician may work through a problem, brought on stage, to kind of give a sense of to kind of just open up a space to think about that as opposed to um, just being like, oh yeah, well, Chinese players are unfeeling in their performances, right? I don't know, like it's been a while since I've been in the music world, or like it feels like a while at least. So I don't know if that is still true. But that was something that I was specifically kind of trying to engage with, at least in 2015, 2017.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And as far as where you're at now, where do you see your career going from here? Because you've been doing so many different things in your life. Is it
Yeah,
leading to something?
I I feel like it's led to the game that we just made, and that's been something that now I have to think about. Oh, what to do. I think immediately it's more video games.
Mhm.
And I think, in general, as an artist, um, I I have been searching for kind of infrastructural sustainability, for a long time, and that is challenging.
I'm
And
wondering
so,
if you could teach. Remy, you've learned so
oh,
much over the years.
I would love, I mean, I think, I would be interested in, I mean, I have done like, of course, artist talks and, um, at least almost 10 years ago, we did teach, um, high schoolers through the Western Front in some sort of experimental kind of high school program, which was great. Um, in terms of teaching, it would be interesting, but I do think that I'm too compelled to make. I think that distracts me a lot.
Yeah,
But I'm not ruling it out in the future, maybe,
well,
if
that's
that
wonderful.
changes. Yeah.
And are there any other points you'd like to make or anything I've neglected to ask?
Um, no, I think we did. Yeah, nothing on my end.
I think it's been very illuminating for me, and thanks
Yeah.
for speaking to me, Remy. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me.
Okay, I've been speaking with Remy Siu. He's the co-artistic director of Hong Kong Exile, and he's also the founder of the independent video game studio Sunset Visitor.